And we can tell you, we can tell our viewers and listeners that it is the case that Sir Keir Starmer is making this pledge that he will resign, he will stand down if it's found that if he is given a fixed penalty notice for breaching those COVID rules in April last year. I just wonder, Tom, there's a way of looking at this which suggests he must be pretty confident as a former lawyer, indeed as a former Director of Public Prosecutions, no less, head of the CPS. He knows all about evidential bars, the likelihood of securing a prosecution. This is what he did for years. He must be confident he's going to get off.
Well, that is one way of reading it, of course, and let's not forget that Durham Police Force was the police force that sort of let Dominic Cummings off without issuing Dominic Cummings a fixed penalty notice for his long and famous drive to Durham. It's interesting how Durham has become the focal point of so much of our politics in the last few years. But yes, to some extent there is that argument that Sir Keir Starmer thinks he has done nothing wrong. Although on the other hand, it must be said Rishi Sunak thought he had done nothing wrong, was not expecting a fine. Many people in Westminster were very surprised when the Chancellor of the Exchequer received a fine for attending a meeting in the Cabinet Room where there happened to be cake. So really there is all to play for here. I suppose the other calculation is how could Sir Keir Starmer continue on in his job after making such an issue of Partygate for the last 4-5 months, for calling for the resignation of the Prime Minister at the start of, not at the conclusion of the police investigation, but at the start of the police investigation, and indeed calling for the resignation of the Chancellor of the Exchequer for his transgression, which many people would see is a relatively low bar for these fixed penalty notices to be issued. It's clearly a huge gamble, but to some extent it's the leader of the Labour Party who has himself boxed himself into this corner today by talking up the issue of resignation of the Chancellor and the Prime Minister so much for so long. Really, now that the investigation has started on the Labour Party, there's very little else he can do without appearing incredibly hypocritical. The one question that many people will be asking Sir Keir Starmer today, however, is at what point, what threshold does that pledge for resignation reach? If, for example, the police were to say a minor offence occurred and one they will not pursue or issue a fine for, as they did in the case of Dominic Cummings, would he resign in that case as well, if he avoided a fixed penalty notice but the police acknowledged that some wrongdoing may have taken place? It's also important to note here the political consequences of this. It's hard to know that many people in the country would not now know of this event in a way that very few people knew of this event unless they were complete political anoraks in the last few weeks. Well, as a result of this press conference, this is leading press bulletins around the country, and just this morning YouGov, the polling organisation, found that 54% of the country believe that the leader of the Labour Party has probably or definitely broken those rules. This is a massive shift in the way that people are viewing the Labour Party right now, so it's hard to see how the Labour Party leader could do anything else. Conversely, it's odd to see that the Conservative Party is saying that Keir Starmer potentially shouldn't resign, that a fixed penalty notice is, in their eyes, not something worthy of resignation, something, as one backbench Conservative MP said in previous weeks, akin to a parking ticket. Is this really the level at which we should have senior politicians resigning? However, of course, ultimately, as so many political scandals do, this comes down to the charge of hypocrisy.